Hey guys, welcome to the next installment here in our American History Lectures. And today we're going to take a look at the next part of our Depression discussions here, and we're going to see the transition from President Hoover to President FDR and all the policies that FDR is going to try to put in place to try to bring us out of the Great Depression and kind of take us through the duration of the 1930s. So let's do a quick kind of recap of where we are. Remember, President Hoover comes into office 1928. And the stock market crashes happens in October of that year, and he's kind of put in a place where you got to try to figure out how to minimize it. And through things like the Hawley Smoot tariffs and so forth, and high rates of public work programs, he attempts to try to bring American industry back to life. However, none of the policies that he puts in place are effective. And from this, he's criticized heavily because people are still really kind of struggling to survive, and high rates of unemployment are still taking place, up to 25% in some areas. The banking system has collapsed completely. There are multiple times where the banks just completely close. People lose their life savings in these things, and the American people are struggling trying to find answers to this. Now, they're going to be clamoring for somebody who wants to do more, right? President Hoover is somebody who's criticized for not doing enough, not enough intervention. So we see kind of we're kind of breaking away from the American conservatives in the 1920s, where laissez-faire presidents or the government does less, to now Americans want more intervention, like we saw during the progressive era. So by 1932, President FDR is going to run against Herbert Hoover on the Democrat ticket, and he is going to win easily. We can see here the first election, 1932, that he wins 89% of electoral votes in almost every single state except for a handful. And from this, FDR will kind of work towards trying to end the Great Depression. He will come in with his first 100 days plan and his New Deal, all these programs to really expand the role of the federal government and kind of get away from the laissez-faire altogether. So here we can kind of see the unemployment rates, and again, when the stock market crashes, where we are, and how it rises very, very quickly over the next couple of years under Hoover's time period. It peaks in 1933, and then will kind of slowly rescind and kind of hover, and then it will hit again in 1938. And then World War II is what will actually end the Great Depression in 1939, because from there the Americans are able to go back to work. These factories are producing weapons to help supply the Allies, and then once the Americans get involved as well in the war in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, it brings a complete end to the Depression altogether. One of the things that FDR was known for was his ability kind of to command the floor, command the room that he was speaking in, and to provide leadership. And people felt like from the way he talked and the messages that he brought, that he was going to be able to end it. In his inaugural address, the famous quote is that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And the idea is that everything will be okay, and this depression will kind of get through and will get better. So when FDR comes to power, becomes president, he is going to really kind of promise the American people that the government is going to step in, and the federal government will try to ensure that everybody has a job and that everybody can kind of survive through this time period. And we're going to see a collection of what's called the alphabet soup of all the legislation and of all the programs and of all the organizations that are created under FDR to expand the role of the federal government, especially the executive branch. And if we look here at the picture, it does a good job of kind of showing the status of what most Americans felt at this point. People who are trying to find jobs, who want to work but cannot find work. And one of the things FDR believes is kind of different from that of Hoover is we're not just going to use money that we bring in from taxation, because obviously revenue's low because people are not working, the economy's not doing well. We're going to borrow money, and it's called deficit spending. So by taking money borrowed and putting it into the economy, that he believed that was going to stimulate and try to bring us out of the Depression. And it's important, a couple terms here to kind of understand the movement, the rapid movement of that for FDR is what's called his first 100 days. And within his first 100 days of where he really tries to get the ball rolling on what's called his New Deal. And the New Deal was his platform for trying to, again, end the Depression by expanding the role of the federal government and providing certain things for Americans to be able to find jobs and to get by. And with this, with all these things that he's going to create within the New Deal, things like the FDIC, the CCC, the WPA, all of these programs, like I said, that's why we call them the alphabet soup of programs, that the whole job is to somehow stimulate the economy, get people back to work, to get businesses back up and running. And the first thing he's going to do is try to address the bank crisis. Again, the banks have basically been shutting down. People have lost their life savings in this, and the banks, the financial sector of the economy is collapsing. These banks have essentially lost all of their money. And he's going to call for a national, what's called a 4-day bank holiday, where all banks were closed. They were going to be inspected by the federal government, and they were going to determine which banks could eventually reopen for business and for people to be able to put their money in and to invest and so forth, and which ones had to be closed permanently. And you can see here from the graph is that after this takes place, the number of bank failures has been relatively low and continues to be relatively low. Americans will slowly kind of work their way back to trusting banks, because a lot of people had lost their life savings during the Great Depression times when these banks had closed from overinvestments and overspending. And that's why we kind of think of as like the old stereotype of old grandpa who hides his money under his mattress, or who digs holes in his backyard to place the money in where to save it rather than putting it in the bank. Those things will kind of go by the wayside, and we're going to finally again get back to a stable financial system. One of the other things that he's also going to do with the banking system is, like I mentioned earlier, create what's called the FDIC. And if you ever notice, for banks that you maybe use or your family uses, if you have an account somewhere, a savings account, almost every single bank is FDIC assured, and usually it says that somewhere on their platform. What that essentially is, the FDIC was a federal agency that insures all bank deposits. So the federal government, let's say that you have an account with $10,000 in it, and your bank closes and goes out of business, the FDIC, or the federal government, will back that $10,000 so you don't lose that money. So it's a way to kind of insure, and I believe the number is up to $250,000 they will insure your money. So what smart people do with, a lot of money, they will just invest in different accounts, so that way they don't have an account with more than that money in it, so that way in case something does happen they don't lose it. But this is just another example of trying to stabilize the banking industry. Again, we're looking at FDR. We talked about how he's kind of this stable force, this leadership force that people saw as somebody who's going to kind of calm the storm and get people through. And one of the things he would use, to make sure that I would know this as well, the fireside chats, where he would just talk to the people over the radio, and families all around the country would gather in front of their radios, just like we have the State of the Union addresses today, and would listen to President FDR talk about what new programs are going to put in place, what their purposes was for, what his goals were for, and how he planned to kind of help people through these times. And these addresses kind of gave people confidence that, or it showed them that the government was trying to actively take a role, and it kind of altered, even though President Hoover was not a laissez-faire president, it made the appearance that, unlike Hoover, FDR was trying to do something. One of the more famous first ladies as well, his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, would go around, much like how we saw in the last presidency that Michelle Obama did this for President Obama's policies. They would go around and campaign, kind of be the eyes and the ears and the heart for the policies, and try to go around to express concerns that people might have, or to try to promote the ideas and kind of help them understand what the policies are going for, or what they're being put in place to try to do. So it was a way to kind of campaign and use her bully pulpit, the word that we talked about before, to try to express the need for FDR's policies. So if we want to try to break down the New Deal, we kind of would break it down into 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And each of these parts are meant to be put in place to do these things. So the first one being relief, to create job programs, or to try to lower unemployment. That's what some of the things like the WPA is going to be used for, or the CCC, which establishes certain things or certain industries to try to help people get back to work, creating what's called public work programs, where the federal government would create jobs for people to go to work, to create what's called infrastructure, so bridges, tunnels, dams, things like that, to try to get people back to work. Now, recovery, this would follow under the NRA. And when we think of the NRA, we think of like the National Rifle Association, not that NRA. So with the NRA, or with a lot of these recovery programs, are ways to try to kind of bring businesses back, to try to recover from failed business practices. A lot of these were used as ways to try to regulate negotiations between labor and management, and also kind of ensure that people had the right to strike and had the right to do certain things within their labor unions. The last one being reform, and the Social Security Act or the SSA would be a good example of this, and this is something that we still have in place today. If any of your grandparents are retired, or a lot of them are probably using or living on social or having Social Security checks brought to them every month. And essentially what this is a retirement fund for people who were elderly, so they did not have to work up until death. It gave them a way to kind of retire or to try to live out the rest of their years with not having to work in these factories, because the largest demographic of injuries and also death in factories were the elderly, were 60 plus. So this gave a way for them to try to, to get out of that system, to have a few years of retirement before they eventually had passed away. So the Social Security Act is still something that's put in place today. Again, so whenever you guys are working, or whenever I'm working, the federal government takes money out of our paychecks and puts it into a big fund, and then that money is distributed to people who are not currently working. One of the other things that FDR and the New Deal will do is provide relief checks or unemployment checks for people who were not working within these job programs, or who were still struggling to find work. And you can kind of see how it was broken down by different states, to where, and again, where the less factories are in these southern states is where unemployment is the highest at times. So this was a way, kind of like how unemployment is today, for people to get a check to at least survive in the times of not being able to work. Again, here's a good example of showing the the relief stage of the New Deal, with trying to get people back to work and creating public works programs. That's what the CCC did. Allowed for young men to be able to get back to work. Again, the WPA would do this as well, where it would hire people to create, again, infrastructure, create buildings, create roads, and so forth, to go towards these different states' infrastructure plans. And with this, then, we have more programs that are put in place to kind of recover, to try to provide relief moving forward, and try to prevent future stock market crashes in the same instance of that of 1928. There are going to be certain regulations with the Securities and Exchange Commissions, where it puts regulations on the stock market to try to ensure certain trades are not taking place, or certain trade practices are taking place that would prevent, or that would allow for another stock market crash to happen. Another program, the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, was created to bring electricity and, again, infrastructure jobs of people building these infrastructures of electricity and dams and so forth, to provide hydroelectric power in different states in the South, especially in places in rural areas where power had still, or electricity was still not a guarantee. So again, another example of trying to get people back to work. Another example of aid that's being put in place here is the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is meant to actually pay farmers to not work. We talked about during the Gilded Age, one of the struggles that farmers had was overproduction. And when overproduction happened, deflation occurred in their economic sector because there was too much supply. So what the hope was is that by decreasing supply would increase price, and then allow for farmers to get back to a stable economy, or a stable part of their economic system. And one of this, it did help farmers with bank foreclosures, but it never really did with a way to stimulate the economy. It never really kind of brought back. And a lot of farmers eventually will kind of leave the sector, leave that industry, because of with technology, there's just too much production. You don't need as many hands to create this. We talked about that multiple times, where less and less people are needed to farm to create the supply needed. So with the New Deal, kind of the legacy, or the overwhelming impact of it, we can see here is that although unemployment will reduce to some rates, and it will hit peaks and valleys, it never truly comes to an end. The Great Depression will last all the way throughout the 1930s, and it's not until World War II that we actually get ourselves out of the Great Depression. So even though that it restored hope, it never really truly came. And from this, the New Deal will, obviously, because it's not working the way that FDR had hoped, it will lead to criticism on both sides of the political spectrum. So you will have conservatives from the more of the Coolidge side of the political spectrum that will say that they need to reduce the role of government. They actually need to go back to more of a laissez-faire to get businesses back to work. And then you have people like Senator Huey Long, who is more of the very, very left side, who is even farther left than FDR, who believes that the government's not doing enough, and that people should propose even more taxation, and give a guaranteed living wage, or a guaranteed salary wage, to every family to be able to live on. And one of the quotes here we can see from a speech that Huey Long gives, if you read here with the first part, he says, "How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat?" what he's essentially saying is that he believes there needs to be more of an equal distribution of wealth. So again, he wants to tax people 100% over a million. So he's basically saying you cannot make more than this amount of money, and the government is going to take that money and distribute it equally to other people. So this would be more of the socialism, communism ideas that again that are spreading, that are going through the United States after the successful takeover of Russia. And we saw under Eugene Debs and other political socialist parties as well.